don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello again, and thanks so much for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Just a reminder that our PBL Summer Conference, which is titled PBL Grow 24, is open for registration, and you can find that at wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see it along the top menu there. This is our 5th time offering this, and it'll be in our home base of Louisville, Kentucky in June, and we'd love to have you attend if you're interested in learning more about how to implement and design project-based learning. We also have a couple of online courses available now, one which is PBL On Demand and another called Creating a Culture of Inquiry. Those are on sale for a limited time only at a deeply discounted price, so please go to, again, wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see online courses along the top menu, and you can find them there. As always, all of our professional development offerings are at wegrowteachers.com, and I'd encourage you to visit that and check out all of our blog pieces that you can learn from and share if you are so inclined. In addition to our main website, we of course have our ThoughtStretchers education community, which you can find at ThoughtStretchers.org. This is meant to be a place where you can have conversations that are more intellectually nourishing and less toxic and polarized. We have lots of events that we are offering throughout the spring, and you can find those in the events tab. So please jump on over to ThoughtStretchers.org and create an account and sign in if you are already a member, and join us for those conversations. As always, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any comments, questions, or concerns. Today's episode is the archived audio of an online discussion that we held as part of our ThoughtStretchers education community. We had Karen Gazith, who is an author of a book about reading instruction and evidence in neuroscience, Christie Biggerstaff, who is the Early Literacy Director for the Kentucky Department of Education, and Sonya Thomas, who is the CEO of a parent advocacy group called Nashville Propel. I really enjoyed this discussion, and we got into lots of the details around neuroscience and how to push better reading instruction forward. We'll also be publishing a blog piece that will correspond with this that has a summary of some of those points, as well as this podcast being embedded in there. So I invite you to go to wegrowteachers.com and check out the blog post, which will be in the literacy category. And of course, I also encourage you to go to ThoughtStretchers.org and check out the future events that we have online for this spring, and sign up or sign in and RSVP to join us for one of those discussions. Welcome if you are listening and watching in the archive version. We're going to talk about reading instruction, evidence in neuroscience, ThoughtStretchers education community, and I appreciate the 3 guests here joining us to talk about this and their perspective. They all, hopefully, as I was saying before we started recording, have much more expertise than I do. And if not, then we're in big trouble. But we're going to start with some introductions and then some general conversation, or some general questions, and then some conversation, and see where this leads us. So let's start with Karen. Karen is the author of the book that we're going to kind of use as a little bit of a center for the conversation, The Power of Effective Reading Instruction, How Neuroscience Informs Instruction Across All Grades and Disciplines. And then we'll go to Christie and Sonya and do the introductions and go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as you said, solution tree author, and my first book was Teaching with Purpose, How to Thoughtfully Implement Evidence-Based Practice in the Classroom. And second book, as you mentioned, Drew, about reading. I have been working in K-12 schools for decades. I won't say how many decades, but many. And I've been on faculty at McGill University in Montreal, also for decades, teaching courses on inclusion assessment, and a course on reading development, all at the graduate level at university.
Okay, Christie?
I am Christie Biggerstaff, and I am the Director of Early Literacy in the Office of Teaching and Learning at the Kentucky Department of Education. This is my second year in this role as Division of Early Literacy Director. But prior to that, I was a practicing educator. I was a fourth and fifth grade reading teacher for a little while, an assistant principal and a principal for around 8 years. And then I moved to the district office to be instructional supervisor over curriculum and instruction in Monroe County schools here in Kentucky. My husband is a practicing superintendent in the neighboring district, so we are an education family. So that's generally our discussion topic around the dinner table every night. And then I have 3 students in public education here in Kentucky. One just graduated actually nursing school, and I've got a high schooler, and then I've got an elementary student as well. So it's a passion in my household. It's been a passion in my career, and literacy specifically has kind of been a thread since I started in fourth and fifth grade reading, and that thread is carried through all the way to this role.
Okay, great. Sonya?
Well, hello. I am Sonya Thomas, and I just like to start off and say I'm just somebody's mama. I have 4 children. I do this work because I never want another parent or grandparent to feel the way that I felt when I realized that my son was not getting the education that he needed and he deserves. And I am the executive director of Nashville Propel, and the Propel stands for Parents Requiring Our Public Education System to Lead. I get up every day with a team as we organize and develop parents into powerful parent leaders to ignite a movement that demands equitable education policies and practices in Nashville public education. And that's what we're going to do every day. I believe that all children deserve and they have the right to be taught how to read. And it is a passion for me. I believe that reading is an opportunity that everybody deserves. And I believe that it's a human right. And so it is my passion, but it's not all of the work that I do. I think that there's so much work to do. I believe in partnership. I believe in parents and educators being partners as change agents in this work. And I'm glad to be here with you all as I represent Black and Brown parents who have children who are zoned to attend the lowest performing schools in the state of Tennessee.
Great.
So I'm just going to add, because my kids are going to listen to this and they're going to say, well, why didn't you talk about us? So I have 3 kids. And actually, my kids have been amazing. They've read the books. They edited my books. They give me amazing feedback, as does my husband. So got to mention that as well, because hopefully they'll listen to this and give me feedback like they always do.
Well, now I have to mention my kids. So I was a teacher for 15 years, and my mom was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and I tried really hard not to become one, but it was eventual, and I was drawn into that by substitute teaching in a first grade classroom in Houston, Texas, where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do post bachelor's degree. Graduated from Michigan State, grew up in Michigan, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and so I substitute taught because it was a great job. At that point, I'm trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and they would call me and ask me if I'd want to work, and I'd say yes or no, and even if I said no, they'd call me back the next day and ask me again, and so that's a pretty good gig. But I remember walking into a first grade classroom the first time and just being terrified, but I loved it and kept going back, and then I ended up going back getting my teaching certificate and taught special education in Jefferson County, which is Christie will know very well, Louisville, Kentucky here, and then moved into the regular ed classroom in middle school social studies, which is where my certification was, teaching out in Napa, California, and came back to where I live now, which is Shelbyville, Kentucky, and taught high school 2001 to 2012. And I do have 2 daughters, 15 and turning 17 very soon. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that I hadn't really thought much about their reading and reading instruction. I suppose that's a somewhat of a privilege, right? And so you say, well, why is that? Well, they learned how to read and didn't seem to have any real trouble with it. They're not super avid readers. My youngest isn't the biggest reader, but as I kind of started diving into this over the last few years with the recent publicity, one of the things that I recognized, or I did do, was go back and looked at old pictures and videos, and I see pictures and videos of my daughters doing phonics and doing things like that. And it's like, well, I guess that's one of the reasons they learn how to read. So we'll certainly talk about that. And I know Christie's got probably some stories to tell about the shift in Kentucky and trying to move that rock and that kind of thing. Well, let's start talking about the book itself. So the Neuroscience of Reading, and that's one of the things that grabbed my eye when I heard about this book, Karen, because there's lots of books on reading, right? And there's lots of materials, lots of things, lots of people talking about reading and yelling about reading and yelling at each other and blaming each other. But the neuroscience, I thought, well, that's something that was unique. So I'm curious how you came to that, and maybe if you can talk a bit about, the book in general, but obviously that neuroscience piece. How did you learn about that, and what were the findings there? Because the first chapter is the neuroscience of reading.
Right. So I have been teaching, as I said, I've been teaching a graduate level on reading development and challenges for, I would say, probably about a decade, and took very seriously the need to teach teachers how to teach kids how to read. And as the field was changing over the past, I would say, two decades, I wanted to make sure that I was going to provide the teachers with all the tools that they needed to make sure that kids learned how to read. And I've worked in schools for years and years, K through, we have grade 11, and I saw kids who were proficient readers, not proficient readers, and it wasn't by chance. And my commitment as somebody working in a university was to make sure that what I was imparting on my students was good, effective science. And in, looking at what's there, there is so much out there about how kids learn how to read. So for me, the greatest challenge is what this bottleneck, and the bottleneck is making sure that the science works its way into the classroom, because there's an enormous amount of research and evidence-based practice. So the evidence is, this stuff really works, but how do we make sure that we break through that bottleneck from the research into the classroom? And in learning about, and in doing research in the area, researching the science of reading, and so many of the researchers who have examined this, there's so much out there in terms of, I would say there's a couple of critical pieces that everyone needs to know. And one is that our brains are not wired to read. Our brains are wired for language. So all you need to do is expose a child to language. They will learn how to speak. Reading is very different. Our brains are not, from an evolutionary perspective, our brains are not primed or wired to read. Therefore, effective reading instruction is imperative. And in fact, what we are doing when we effectively teach kids how to read is we are rewiring their brain. And it's often called, neuronal recycling, because they're having to take parts of the brain. For example, there's a part right back here that is primed for recognizing faces and objects. And proficient readers actually become less primed for faces and objects as they learn to develop this skill of reading. So the other, just mentioning one other thing in terms of the neuroscience of reading, it's important for people to understand, you mentioned about your daughter and phonics, it's so important for people to understand that there really is one effective highway to learning how to read. It's building connections between these two parts of the brain, again, that have to go through neuronal recycling. And we have to build this efficient highway. And it's not correct to say that there are many different ways to doing it. It's just the research has not shown that to be the case. There really is, as you mentioned, through effective phonics instruction and the stuff that comes before that, like development of good phonological awareness, there's a highway that has to be developed, this speedy highway. That we need to do our work as educators to make sure that all children, and I love what Sonya said, it is a child's human right to learn how to read. And it's our responsibility as educators to learn the science, to learn the practice of reading, to teach kids, all kids, how to become proficient readers.
So I'll hold up the I've got the book here, right? And you've got the different pieces and parts of the brain, and you do get into some nuts and bolts in the book, and some of the stuff that I thought was really fascinating is like the actual sort of encoding and almost a plasticity kind of thing, right? It's like these things are happening as they do these things, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's like fMRI, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that. Sure.
Yeah.
So over the past couple of decades, functional magnetic resonance imaging has really opened up the field of neuroscience, specifically as it pertains to reading. And what you see through this functional magnetic resonance imaging is you are able to give the individual a task. So the task could be identifying whether or not words rhyme or not. And the task could be reading a text and trying to decode it, or trying to comprehend the text. And what this functional magnetic resonance imaging does is it enables you to see the areas of the brain that are becoming oxygenated. So the oxygenated parts of the brain are the parts of the brain that are in fact working as somebody is learning how to read. And what we've learned through the research is effective readers really show an enormous amount of activity in this very specific part of the brain called the parietal temporal region. So it's through really, really effective early phonics, phonological awareness, and building phonics instruction that we start to see that part of the brain really being lit up. And again, that's this is the essential part of the brain that enables the child to break words apart and then to map the sounds onto specific letters. So you're able to see through the fMRI the critical task of early reading. What you see from those who are less proficient in reading is when they try to engage in these tasks, rather than the parietal temporal lobe being lit up, which is the part of the brain, again, that breaks words apart and maps sounds onto letters, you see that the right part of the brain is receiving the oxygenated blood. In other words, this is the part of the brain that's being activated. That shows that what kids are in fact doing, and those kids that struggle, they're not decoding, but they're looking at the word as though it's a picture, an image. And there is only one way how to read. The only way to read is to be able to break sounds apart and map the sounds onto the letters that represent those sounds. And if we don't identify early on through good assessments and get in there early when the kids are young and make sure, especially those kids that are at risk, that have a tendency to look at the word as though it's a picture, we've got to see the best way to see if they're actually decoding is to give them nonsense words. If they can't read nonsense words, it means they've never seen those words before. Therefore, they weren't able to visually encode the word. So through early assessment, we're able to see if kids are decoding. And, I didn't put the image in the book, but you can see effective teachers are brain changers. They actually change kids' brains from the brain that receives the oxygenated blood here to kids. You can see it through the fMRI that they're actually learning how to decode these words, and they do become proficient readers. So, it's critical for me, again, a passion, Sonya, like you mentioned. We've got to know how kids learn how to read. And we have to commit. I've been working with kids who struggle to read for decades and decades. I've never, ever, ever met a kid who could not learn how to read. Ever. Not one. Some needed more help than others, but never met a kid that couldn't read.
So one of the things, again, that really resonated with me and caught my eye was that neuroscience piece. And so the fMRIs, as you're mentioning, so we definitely have, I think, a challenge, and I'm curious to hear, Christie, how you've tried to navigate this and what you've seen, and Sonya as well, but from sort of the Department of Education kind of perspective, especially trying to sort of change policy and practice and that kind of thing. We talk about, science of learning has become a sort of trademark and a trigger term or whatever. It's one of those things. Everything's a trigger term at this point, right? But we say, well, this is what the research shows. But I have my research, and you have your research. And when we look at the fMRI, then we see the actual process. We can actually almost like peek inside somebody's brain. And so my perspective is it changes, or it's sort of bolsters that position of, well, that's what the science does show, because it's not just a research paper, but it's actual fMRI evidence. So, Christie, I'm curious what you've seen over your time in Kentucky, because Kentucky, correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of known as a balanced literacy, reading recovery kind of state, and we've got some real conflict and tension, in case you haven't heard. So tell us what that's been like for you from your perspective.
Well, I've heard, Drew, a couple of times that we have some educators that want to hold fast to those beliefs and practices. The challenge that I have found, really, because you do have those anomalies in the state where, people are trying to advocate for balanced literacy. But truly, surprisingly, I have found that the challenge is more about getting the correct information in the correct hands and building that efficacy for literacy best practices with our educators. They just don't know. They just haven't been told. They're busy. They're busy people. Educators, truly, most educators want to do what's best for children. I mean, that's why they got in the job in the first place. They want to do what's best. And I think we've come to a position in our state specifically that we are trying to equip them with this knowledge, and they just didn't know it. So Senate Bill 9, the Read to Succeed Act, passed in Kentucky in 2022. So that started the funding for all of these mind shifts and practices that we're trying to implement. So one of the first, and I think most pertinent things that it allowed us to do as a state is to give the professional learning. So to get the correct information in the correct hands. It's an opt-in professional learning. It's not mandated in the Read to Succeed Act. But surprisingly, and let me back up and say before I tell you how many we have in there, it is the professional learning that we're giving through the Kentucky Reading Academies is letters, language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling. It is a solid professional development, professional learning around the science of reading, but it is a heavy lift. Like, it is not an easy professional learning. It's 2 years. So people have to dedicate, 2 years to this learning. It's 8 units long that we broke it up into 4 units per year. And it's a heavy lift, especially an educator that already has a full plate in front of them to then go back and spend nights and weekends and days off trying to learn all this information. But we do have currently in the state of Kentucky 4,000 of our educators in our first 2 cohorts of that training. And we've got another cohort that is going to be opened this coming fall. So I'm hoping that we have even more to join us in cohort 3. But just equipping educators with the accurate information, just as Karen was saying, like, there is a science to teaching students how to read. And literacy practices have been rigorously researched. Like, we know how to do that now. And it's just getting that information into teachers' hands and then showing them how. Because they can learn, and they do in letters, and they can learn about all of the pathways and all of the science behind how the brain learns to read, and that information's vital. Like, you need to know the why. But then it's like, now what? They need the practices. They need the information of what am I going to do now that I know? How do I implement this? And that's really what my division has been trying to do very passionately, because we do know that we have to have a shift in practices. Like, there's some obvious shifts that have to take place after you know this information. This is what needs to be done.
So, Sonya, you have a different perspective, and you said Metro Nashville is the district in which you're spending your most of your energy, right? Another pretty large district in a pretty large city, and not all that dissimilar from Louisville, Kentucky, which of course is in Kentucky. I'm curious what you've seen and where you sort of interact more. Is it with obviously with parents, but how much with teachers and the educators and educational leadership and even policymakers on up to somebody like Christie and the Department of Education, and what that's been like for you.
So I don't see a difference in what we're saying. I always say that there's three victims here. There's the children, there's our educators, and then there's our parents. So no, I don't see that there's a difference from what we're all seeing in this room. Just imagine doing something that you love and you wake up every day to be an educator, only to be told you're doing it all wrong, right? My email is full of educators who, when we started this work, were reaching out to me and like, oh my God, I have been teaching children wrong. And so I spent a lot of my time saying, you're a victim, sir or ma'am. Like, you didn't mean to. But by 12 noon, when we figure it out, we got to get up and we got to fight together and fight for the right things. So I want to make sure that the people know that this is not like just a teacher problem. This is a systemic failure, right? And so the state of Tennessee has put together what I think is a strong literacy package. And that consisted of making sure that our educators get the professional development, which, as Christie is saying, is really hard, right? Because people are like, oh, I've been doing this for so long. So you got to change people's habits and mindsets. And, you got to get them out of the defense and all of those things. And so one of the things that I have began to do is to work with a lot of educators, like being a part of the Memphis Literacy Conference and going to speak to them about us being change agents together. Like, this is not something that we can all do alone. We got to come together and do this work together. Another thing that I do, I changed my whole parent advocacy fellowship curriculum last year, and it's around literacy. I wanted to answer the question. I posed this question about 3 years ago and nobody could answer it. But my question is, how does a parent know the difference between a struggling reader and poor instruction? Now, I know the answer to that question. The question is, poor instruction can cause a struggling reader, right? And so what I did was frame my curriculum around that question. I wanted to make sure that parents understood what it means to actually know how to read. And all that get understanding. I wanted to make sure that they had the supports that they needed so that they can do what they need to do at home to work as partners with the school. But I also wanted to make sure that they had the tools to demand better for all students. And so I put them through a 4 to 6 week parent advocacy fellowship. Last year, we trained 90 parents in that parent advocacy fellowship. I'm also working with Stanford University with their ROAR program. It's a rapid online assessment. And what we're doing, even in this moment, is we are assessing students K through 12 and being able to provide reports that parents understand. Oftentimes, parents have no idea the language that schools are speaking to them. MTS, RTI, like all of these big things and big words that are so overwhelming. Like, we don't understand that, and all those graphs and all of those things and percentile. So we're working with Stanford University to create parent-facing reports. And not just like reports to say that the child is approaching or they're proficient. Like, these reports really break down what is going on. People don't go to the doctor and the doctor says they have cancer and don't tell them what kind of cancer it is. No, they find out what kind of cancer it is and they treat that cancer. And so I want to make sure that people understand that parents are capable of understanding what it means to know how to read. And they are committed to working with schools as partners to move the needle for all children.
Well, so that brings up a question for me, and by all means, Christie and Karen, and all three of you, jump in and ask each other questions, because I'm sure you have better questions than I do. But one of the things that I advocate for is school choice, but I also think there's another piece of that, which is we want to make sure that we have good choices, right? Just another choice that's not a good choice is not necessarily a good idea. And so one of the things I'm usually met with as a retort is, sort of paternalism. Oh, parents know best, right? Parents know best. And I understand that sentiment, right? We certainly want to rely on parents and making their choices for their own children. I think that's a really important thing. But Sonya, to your point, like, parents are they may not know. They may on a variety of issues of instruction and teaching and learning, that's not their expertise. They may be relying on what they've known as their own student experience, or what they've heard from somebody else, or maybe they're seeing their kid looks like they're reading, and we've certainly heard about this, where they're memorizing words and eventually they can't memorize enough words and they actually can't read. And so you think about, how do you help parents really sort of demand this? I'm curious, any of you, if you've had experience or stories. Sonya, I'm sure you do. What are the things that actually do move that needle with that parent population? Because it's always been, or long been, my position that if parents knew what school could and should be outside of just reading, just in general, that they would demand better, and that would move the needle. So I'm kind of curious from any of you how you've seen that play out, and what does move the needle with them.
If you don't mind, I'll start the work that I do every day. I believe that the school matters. I never tell a parent what school to send their child to, but I want to make sure that they're able to make the informed decision, and starting with the vision for their child. So first of all, if children are going into school buildings and they're not being taught how to read, they're not learning how to read, like we ain't doing, something adding up in the first place, right? The other thing I would say, the biggest system failure across education landscape all across this country is engaging parents. Keep your engagement. I don't want it. Partnership is what it has to be. And we have to make sure that the system as it is stops hoarding information from parents. Making the assumption, I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, one of my organizers, she needed to leave the meeting earlier, and she went and did a parent-teacher conference with the school about her second grade, and she came back and she was distraught, totally distraught, because in that meeting, they told her, hey, we're thinking about holding your daughter back. We got 8 more weeks of school, and you're just now telling me that you're going to hold my daughter back. So all along, they've been saying she's approaching, right? Nobody knows what that means. They've been sending stuff home. As I got in the conversation with the school, they were sending home information for the kid to blend and to do some vowel sound work, right? And they were also teaching the kid to see it, say it, spell it. I know Karen is probably going to cringe off of that one. See it, say it, spell it. Again, I'm going to ask the question. How does a parent know the difference between a struggling reader and poor instruction? The student had the same teacher who's been doing the interventions with the child. I asked the school, again, how is this parent supposed to know the difference between a struggling reader and poor instruction? That is all of the information that they gave to that parent, is that the child was approaching. They were hoarding information and made the assumption that what they were sending home, that it was actually being done in the way that matches what is being done at school. Nobody trained the parent, who was more than capable of being trained and mirroring what is going on in the school. But again, nobody goes to the doctor and gets told they have cancer, and nobody tells them what kind of cancer they have. They don't tell them they tell them what stage it is and what treatment. And so I believe, number one, there has to be some real partnership. And that is something that school system after school system has struggled with. I mean, I've worked with Dr. Sonya Thomas, like the CEO of Baltimore schools, all superintendents across this country. And the biggest struggle that I look at them and tell them, stop engaging folks. Learn to partner with parents. That is how we move the needle. You bring your expertise, I'm going to bring my expertise. You bring your commitment. I'm going to bring my commitment. That is how we make sure, and movements such as Nashville Propel, who will make sure that parents have the knowledge, activate them to take action.
Karen, anything you want to vocalize as you cringe?
I have a whole bunch of notes here. So I'm going to share a couple of things. So to go with parents, so it's extremely difficult for parents to approach a school system, to approach a principal, a vice principal, a teacher, ask the questions, challenge the school. And I love the fact that you help them advocate, because parents have to advocate, kids have to advocate for themselves, but we have to hold ministries of education accountable. It's unfair to expect that the parents are going to be the ones that are going to go to the school and say, you're not doing your job. And again, I agree with so much of what, is being said here, because teachers want to do right by kids. That's why they went into the profession. But we have to tool them with what they need. Some universities do, some universities don't. But we have to tool them with what they need to be able to teach kids how to read. So the responsibility cannot be on the parent to know what it looks like. I love the fact that we help them advocate, but we have to think about where the accountability lies. And the accountability has to be, ministries, jurisdictions, again, different in each state. I'm sure certainly different in our Canadian provinces. But again, we have to think about who is accountable for making sure the kids are learning how to read. And it's unfair to put that on the parents. So that's the one thing that I wanted to mention. Second thing I wanted to mention is what I tell my students at university, and what I tell parents and teachers and principals constantly is, teachers should be communicating the following things to parents. This is what your child should know and be able to do at this grade level. So if your child's in grade 2 or your child's in grade 5, you say 5th grade. This is what your child should be doing at this point. So the being really clear about the standards or the competencies in clear, non-jargon language. A sign of brilliance is to take complicated ideas and make them simple. Nobody is impressed by complicated jargon. Doesn't impress anybody. The real challenge is to take complicated concepts and make it simple. So we need to say, okay, this is what your child should know. This is what your child should be able to do. Second, this is where your child is having difficulty. We've got, the earlier we communicate that with parents, the better. So your child should be reading, consonant, vowel, consonant words at this, or your child should be reading X number of words fluently per minute. This is what your child should be doing. This is what they're struggling with. Number 2. Number 3 is the most important. This is our plan. This is what we're going to do about it. And number 4, this is how we're going to communicate with you how your child is doing going forward. So I think those 4 things are critical. What your child should know and be able to do, where your child is at and where your child's having difficulty, what we're going to do to help your child, and how we're going to communicate your child's progress. So that's the second thing I wanted to mention. I'm going to go back to balanced literacy, if you don't mind, because you asked that question. The greatest challenge with balance, there's only one way to read. The only way to read is to learn the sounds, to break a word up into sounds and to map the letters onto the sounds. And then, of course, you need vocabulary, fluency, comprehension. But the early, building blocks are being, knowing the sounds and words and mapping the letters onto those sounds. That's essential. For kids who struggle, that's hard. That's hard work. But teachers are able to support kids if we provide teachers with the tools that they need to teach kids how to read. So if I say to a student, there's a really difficult way to do something, which is to learn how to decode. But by the way, there's also a really easy way. Here, why don't you just look at the picture and guess at the word? We do that with balanced literacy. We say you can, sort of take the hard way, or if the hard way is too hard, we'll give you a really easy way with all these tricks. Of course, when presented with these multiple options, these kids who struggle, are going to pick the easier way for them, which is look at pictures and memorize. The problem is that we're actually kicking the can down the road, because they'll be able to appear as though they're reading in grade 1. They're going to appear as though they're reading in grade 2. Once they move forward, we're going to realize that in grade 4, all we did was kick the can down the road, because they're in grade 4, no more pictures on the page, and they haven't learned how to decode. And what we often say is we have to develop a love of reading. You want to develop a love of reading, teach kids how to read. There's no shortcut. We want them to love reading. If we teach them how to read, and we really give them the tools so that they could read to learn and read for pleasure, really, they're going to love to read, but we need to equip them. Last quick point, self-efficacy is critical for kids and teachers. If we don't make sure that kids feel capable, feel like they can, as soon as a kid puts together a CVC word, I say to that kid, you are now a reader. You are a reader. Now we're going to build. But we have to do the same thing for teachers. If we come to teachers and we say, everything you've learned is wrong, how are we then, building self-efficacy that John Hattie helped us understand and learn through his meta-analysis is critical for teachers. We have to help teachers feel capable. There you go. Self-efficacy for kids and teachers. So we've got to, again, we're not going to say sure, balanced literacy is good, but we have to find a good way. But, we have to make sure that we're building students' self-efficacy and teachers' self-efficacy.
So one of the things that struck me in a conversation that I had for our podcast with Kareem Weaver, who you may know from Right to Read film, was I asked him, how do you persuade all of these people, right? The necessary parties in the ecosystem, the teachers, the parents, and policymakers, and all of that. And one of the things that he said that really caught my attention was to show, I'll butcher how he put it much more eloquently, but basically show them where it works. And one of the places, Christie, I'm going to guess you're probably aware of, is I think it's in Eastern Kentucky. There's a school district that raised the reading rates and the ability of kids to read pretty substantially. I don't remember off the top of my head. I meant to make a note and forgot about it. You probably know about it. He actually, Kareem actually tweeted about it again the other day. I thought, that would be good to bring up in this conversation. So I'm curious what you know about what they did, because I haven't looked at what they did and how they changed their programming to help kids read, but obviously it had some real results.
Clay County, I believe, is the district. I've talked to their instructional people before, because you're right. I mean, showing educators what good literacy practices look like is powerful. And going back to what Karen just said, well, I'll say this. If I wasn't a panelist and I was a participant, I'd be throwing hearts up in the chat. It's everything that they're saying, because, it's just, we're of one mind on this topic for sure. But the mantra that we've kind of adopted around not that whole, the teacher is the victim here. One of the victims here is, well, now that we know better, we're going to do better. So showing them places like Clay County, showing them specifically when we have a cohort of administrators, because this has to be a top-down approach. Everybody has to be bought in. They must have the same vision for literacy practices. And we have cohorts of educators and specifically administrators visit districts in Kentucky that have had the training, that have implemented best practices, and we show them what that looks like, because that is powerful, as you said, Drew. And I feel like once they see that and they know better and they have that learning and that training, then they can go back to their districts and implement it even better. But I did want to comment real quickly on the parent conversation that we were having, because one of my favorite portions of the Read to Succeed Act is the fact that it gives parents a seat at the table. So in short, and not to bore you with all the policy, but in short, schools and districts have to give a universal screener So it's a temperature check to see if there is an issue or a deficit. And then if that comes back and said, yes, there's something going on with this child, then they have to be given a diagnostic assessment. And that diagnostic assessment kind of deep dives into those sub skills to really pinpoint, as Karen was saying earlier, about, what is it specifically that they are having an issue with? What's the gap? And then they're given a reading improvement plan by a reading improvement team, and the parent is on the team. And that reading improvement plan then lays out that the parent, the teachers, any specialist teachers that they might have, administrators, all come together and say, this is what very clearly the child is struggling with. This is the plan that we all are going to develop together and implement, and this is how we're going to get them there. And then we're going to progress monitor along the way to ensure that they are meeting those goals and those steps. And you're going to be told very often as a parent how that child is doing with that reading improvement plan. So I wanted to tell you that is in Kentucky's Read to Succeed Act, and it's one of my favorite parts because it does take, we all have to be on the same team. We all have to be looking toward the same goal in order to get to where we need to go. And one more thing that just popped into my brain, because Sonya's advocacy with parents and teaching them all that jargon made me remember too that part of that reading improvement plan is a read at home plan. And I was very passionate to make sure that the read at home plan that we created as an example at KDE was very parent friendly. We wanted to teach parents these are the big 5 components of literacy. This is what this means. This is what phonemic awareness looks like. This is what phonics looks like. Here are some simple activities you can do with your child to help them. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to cut anything out and paste it. You can do it in the car ride on the way to school, those type of activities. And really, again, going a step further and teaching them what some of those terms mean. So when they're sitting at the table with the administrators and the teachers and they're creating the plan, those big words that we use of phonics and phonemic awareness don't throw them off kilter. So I wanted to lift that up because it's a very important part of the Read to Succeed Act in Kentucky and what we're doing to shift that mindset and bring the entire team, parents, educators, the community, universities and colleges. We're trying to get us all looking toward the same goal.
So one of the questions that I have, and it popped into my head as you all were talking, is that, we look at all of the kids, and there's different, percentages of kids who've learned how to read. And there's an article that was out recently, I think Tom Lovelace, who I don't know, but he was talking about, we're being a little misleading with what we're saying and saying these kids can't read and are they proficient, that kind of thing. But the reality, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but as I understand it, is that some kids will generally learn how to read kind of regardless if they have phonics or not, and that kind of specific science of reading kind of approach, that there's some percentage that will do that, and that some definitely need a lot of phonics to really help them, and then there's some that will just struggle for dyslexia and those kinds of things. And I'm curious, one, do we know why some of those kids struggle? And I mean, obviously there's some dyslexia and things that are obvious reasons, but then there's sort of that, I guess, middle band, if that makes sense, that definitely need much more intentional reading instruction. And then we get into and I think it's a good segue to Karen talk about some of the things in the book, the reading in response to intervention. You have universal screening and the models for reading support and that kind of thing. So I'm curious, in my mind, those things are connected in some way. Why do some students struggle more than others? And then what are the things beyond just phonics that are really important in sort of the process of getting them to be proficient readers?
So yeah, that's a whole lot of questions there. So we'll try and address them. There you go. So I would say that, like I said earlier, there is only one way to read, right?
Mhm.
I mean, in order to become a proficient reader, you need to recognize that language has a pattern and language can be broken into parts. Eventually, you map those parts onto letter sounds. You learn to develop vocabulary so that you understand what you're reading. You learn to read fluently. And ultimately, you need to be able to read with ease and read to learn and love to read. Everybody needs to be able to decode to read. It's not that some are decoding and others aren't. The ones that are not decoding are actually the ones who are struggling to read.
Right.
The question is not, do some kids, decode and do others not?
Right.
Everybody needs to decode. The ones who are not decoding are the ones who are struggling. So, it's important to keep in mind that the pathway of phonological awareness, playing with sounds, rhyming, being read to, all that kind of early stuff, eventually leading to decoding and the other elements, the big five of reading, essential for everybody. Why some kids are not becoming proficient, some kids are at risk for a whole host of reasons. Lots of things put kids at risk. We need good instruction for all kids, but the ones who are at risk are the most vulnerable to not learning how to read. So, good instruction for all is essential. The ones who are at risk, because there's, family factors, genetic, a relative, a parent, a sibling who struggle to read, they are the most at risk and they desperately need effective instruction. Why some kids don't learn how to read, there's the science of that as well. And, research has shown that kids who struggle actually have, and I speak about this in the book, less white and gray matter in the very specific parts of the brain that are responsible for the dissecting of the word, the analyzing the word, and the mapping the letters onto the sounds. So there's the science, and I think we owe researchers an enormous amount, that it's not that kids are being lazy, it's not that they don't want to read, there's actually something going on. Like, we wouldn't say, you broke your leg, get on with it, but there's actually something going on that's making reading extremely difficult for them. So good instruction is essential for everybody. We have to make sure that all kids learn how to decode, and there are really easy ways to make sure that kids are decoding. There's no escaping the ability to map letters onto sounds in order to become a proficient reader. So I hope that sort of answers that first, or addresses part.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just to move into the second part, and I think it relates to the discussion that we're having here, that we probably can, we're going to end soon, but, we all love reading and we can probably talk about this for hours. I think one of the problems that we've had with teachers is, I think people outside the classroom, whoever those people, we could say administrators, or what we often do, and maybe even resource people, we spend a whole lot of time thinking about why kids are struggling. And we often come to teachers with an answer to the problem. So we come to teachers and we go, this is what you should do. So we identified the problem and we found the solution, and we come to teachers and we say, here's the solution to the problem that we never even discussed with teachers in the first place. So we found the problem before sitting with teachers and saying, do you see that there's a problem, right? I mean, we are so quick to come, I think, often with the answer to a problem without giving teachers the tools to understand how to teach reading, but also the ability to sit with colleagues and talk about what kids need to be able to do and which of the kids are struggling. You mentioned universal screening, and Christie spoke about, the tools that you use. I think what is essential is that there's very simple screening tools. There's lots out there. You can use, AimsWeb and Renaissance and Dibbles and Acadience, and there's lots and lots of other early screeners. Many of them are really good. We have to, and they take minutes. I mean, it's as simple as, can a child decode? Do they know the sounds of the letters? Can they read nonsense words? Can they break a word into parts? How many words are they reading a minute? These really simple assessments of the big five. We need to do those early screening tools again, early, because the earlier we get in there, the better, the more time we have to remediate the difficulties. Then we have to sit down with teachers. We have to show them simple data, and, Sonya, agree, can't be fancy. We've got to stop with these fancy terms, show them the data, show them what it means. And then what we have to do when we're sitting in front of teachers, and I say that as someone who works with teachers, we have to just not speak and allow teachers to look at the data, to have conversations about what they see. So we could ask good questions like, one of the questions I often ask, what percentage of your kids are at proficiency level with decoding? And let them look at the data and let them talk amongst themselves with support, with guidance, but give them the time to understand what the challenges are before we're too quick to come in and sort of overwhelm them with all of these different things that they need to be doing. I love when it comes from the teachers themselves, and data, showing them simple data could be a really good spark to get that conversation going.
Christie and Sonya, anything you want to add to that?
I think people think that a lot of the educators know how to explain the data, and what I'm finding is they're struggling to. And being able to communicate what the data means. So I love the concept of having them to look at it and study and just kind of give their input, and then tailoring that learning for them also is very important, because then you get buy-in too. You get the buy-in that you need, because oftentimes I'm thinking that a lot of educators, they feel attacked, and this is not about attacking. This is about making sure we're doing the right thing for our students. And, one thing that I love to say about the science of reading is that we can cast a wide net and get so many children where they need to be if we use the science. And I think it's just that simple to say to people.
Christie, anything you want to add there?
But just to piggyback off on what she said, and then I'll go to a comment around what Karen said, but structured literacy that's based on the science of reading works for all kids, every one of them, all of them. So yes, amen to that. And I wanted to say too, a fact that I often find very mind-blowing that I share when I do presentations with teachers and administrators in talking about the science of reading is, if you don't intervene with a student often and early, that child, I think it's third grade, if they get to third grade without the supports that they need and the vital interventions that they need to fill in those foundational gaps, then it would take, I think it's 3 hours or more a day working with that student one-on-one to try to fill in that gap. So teachers don't have that time. Nobody has that amount of time to really focus on, a student trying to do that. So that is the whole goal that we're trying to get at in Kentucky, is to do that temperature check with that universal screener and intervene early and often to fill in those gaps, because you do have to. Every brain needs to be able to decode. And Drew, your question earlier, because I had looked into that at one point, I don't know if it was on Twitter or X or whatever it's calling itself nowadays, but it said something, it was alluding to that, so many percent of students learn to read on their own. I think it was like 30%, 20%.
25%.
And what they learn to do is they learn to decode on their own. So they're not explicitly taught by a teacher, but that whole process that Karen was talking about happens. They just do it themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, maybe there's things happening at home or other places, and maybe they just have a proclivity, a gift or whatever. But that seems to me to be one of the stumbling blocks in this conversation, because people say, well, I know kids learn how to read when I do this. Well, some of them, but not all of them. And Christie, I think to your point, the structured literacy works for all kids. So if that's going to work for all kids, then why would we not do that with all kids?
Cast that net, like Sonya said, get them off.
Yeah, and one of the pushbacks, they say it's boring. So then you say, well, that brings me to, I think, the last question here, and I'm curious to hear from all of you on this. We've got the science of reading, trademark, and that's a term that is used as lots of terms are used now, and conflated and flattened and means a lot of different things. But I'm curious what you all might think are some blind spots of the sort of science of reading movement, as it were. I work a lot, or I talk a lot about the sort of science of learning folks and direct and explicit instruction versus inquiry, not specific to reading, but in just generally instruction. And again, talking about Hattie, we talk about teaching with intent and using inquiry and collaborative activities and surface deep and transfer. And so there's to me, I think, some weak spots and weaknesses in the communication and sort of marketing, as it might be, of sort of science of learning. And science of reading certainly, I think, has its devotees and evangelists as well. And so I'm curious, we'll start with you, Sonya. Are you seeing any of that in your interactions, and the people who are, because we're in such a sort of tribalistic us versus them sort of, we're in a fight. Everything's a fight instead of this discussion. And I see the danger, at least, of the whatever it is, science of reading being one of those parties, maybe jumping the shark a little bit and, just not really adding to the discussion. So I'm curious from all of you, and we'll start with you, Sonya, what are you saying, if anything, in that from that perspective?
All right. So I'm not particularly familiar with any blind spots. I have seen wars, if that's what you're referring to, which grieves me. Far too long, children have not been reading. And we're talking about real lives here, real stories. I deal with parents every day on a whole nother level, who have generations of their family who are unable to read. And so I take this with the utmost seriousness. And not to say nobody else does, right? But I retired from nursing in 2020. I was okay, but I wasn't okay, right? And I get up every morning fighting for these families, just to have the right to read. And so what I see is a lot of propaganda and politics around something that I feel is life and death. And so I put my blinders on, and I don't look left and I don't look right. I look straight ahead. I'm optimistic that if we all depend upon the expertise of people like Karen, Christie, and myself as a parent leader, that we're going to change the lives of so many kids, Black, brown, white, it doesn't matter. And so there's a lot of politicking around it, a lot of, I have people chasing me on Twitter, wanting to argue with me about, balanced literacy and the science of reading. And all I tell them is I have receipts. I have the receipts of what works and what doesn't. So I don't have time to argue with people. Let's check the timeline of how long we've been using balanced literacy. And then let's check the data that doesn't lie, right? And let's check the receipts, which are these families who are leaving our systems across this country. Children are leaving this system unable to read, unable to get jobs, unable to do a whole lot of things that they should be able to do. And so, you're looking at a struggling reader. I graduated from high school in 1994 with a 2.1 GPA and a 17 ACT. You are looking at a person who struggles with comprehension. You are looking at a mother who saw her child suffer, who was in the 7th grade reading on a second grade reading level, who did all that she could to help him, that did everything that everybody asked him to do, read to him for 30 minutes, have him to read to you. I spent my mortgage money on a University of Tennessee literacy program one summer. Okay, so I said it to say, it's time out for people to be fighting, right? And we got to really look at the receipts of what's working. The example in Kentucky, shout out. I am so happy. I saw that on Twitter, and I think I turned 5 flips in the house because I'm so optimistic that one day every school district will look like that. And so we just have to just keep advocating the way we are together. I hope, ladies, that this is not the only platform that we sit on together, united, making sure that people understand what they need to understand about reading, and really like dismiss all of the nonsense. We know what to do to make sure that children know how to read, and we need to do it. Point blank.
So, Christie, one of the things, let me segue that because I want to ask you the same question, see if you have any, and Karen as well, but I'm sure you both have, or you all three have heard, that structured literacy, science and learning stuff can be boring for kids. It's the same thing that talk about direct and explicit instruction, which I think can be true of that, right? It can be done poorly. So with that added to the sort of play on the question, if that makes any sense, what have you seen in like the sort of blind spots and propaganda or things like that?
Can I say this real quick? What's boring?
Yeah.
What's boring is the school to prison pipeline when you're sitting in a jail cell. What's boring is when you're sitting in a classroom and your peers can read and you can't. That's boring. And so if children know no different, if we do the science they're not going to know any difference. And if we do it right. And so I'm sorry, but that just like got all over me because it's boring to sit in the jail cell. That's what's boring. I've worked on maximum security death row. So that's boring. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. I mean, she's exactly right. Here's the thing, and I've heard that before from people, the whole boring concept. We adults, bless our hearts, we're selfish people sometimes. And teaching phonics, when we hear it as adults, is probably boring to us. You want to know why? Because we know it. But do you want to know who it's not boring for? Those students in that classroom. It's not boring to students because it's new learning. Like, I have been in so many classrooms in the state of Kentucky, and I live on the Tennessee border, Sonya, so I've been in several classrooms in the Tennessee area too. And when those students are given the tools and the resources they need in order to blend sounds and decode words, that is the opposite of boring. It truly is. And I have seen it over and over and over again in the classroom. And I invite people who say that it's boring. It's like, come with me. Let's just pick a district, pick a district that's doing it, the science of reading, the structured literacy. Pick one, we'll pick a classroom, and I'll show you that's not a boring classroom. It's just the adults in the room who are so self-centered that are hearing that instruction think it's boring to them, but it's not boring to the students. In terms of the war and the whole balanced literacy versus, I will echo what Sonya says, because when I have administrators or educators that I meet with, and I meet with those groups, that either an educator, a district leader, a school leader, 5, 6, 7 times a week, most of the time. That's what I'm passionate about doing, because I know I have to change their beliefs and their minds. And all of my discussions is not centered on that. It's more technical stuff most of the time when it comes to the Read to Succeed. But when I do come across those people, the proof is in the pudding, as my grandma used to say. Like, the proof is there. The data doesn't lie. And I usually ask administrators who are trying to hold on to those ineffective instructional resources or practices or balanced literacy practices, leveled readers. I usually say, how are your state summative scores? What does your universal screener say? How many students do you have in your school that's below benchmark on the universal screener? And every single time, without fail, it's a large number. So then I say, why are we still doing, isn't that the whole definition of madness or insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results? Why are you doing the same things if it's not giving you the results that you need? So then I don't engage in social media or anything like that. But when I am trying to get leaders and educators to look at their data to see what you've been doing with balanced literacy is not working, like the proof is all there. The receipts, as Sonya said, are there. And generally that works.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Karen, what's your response to that? Anything you
want to add? Agree with everything that's been said. When we say that reading is boring, we're putting our adult brains in the brain of a 6-year-old. Reading is not boring. It is opening up a world for kids. And it's boring for us. And one of the reasons why balanced literacy came to be was it was an adult brain putting their adult brain into the brain of a young child learning how to read. And they just said, well, it's boring because of course it's boring for adults. It is anything but boring for kids. And Christie, like you said, all you have to do is walk into a grade 1 classroom with good, solid reading instruction. Those kids are not bored at all. They are thrilled with a world that's being opened up for them because they're actually learning how to read. So that's my comment about the boring. In terms of the science of reading, I want us to move away from the science of reading being a movement, because other things that have been movements. So, I did a session for the Ministry of Education where we were responding to I was being interviewed about reading and some other things. And at some point in the interview, the educator was interviewing me said, what philosophy is what does your belief about education belong to? And I said, no, don't put it into a philosophy. Is it Vygotskian? Don't put this into a philosophy. Don't put this in, it's not a movement. It is evidence that when we do certain things, kids learn how to read. So the danger is to call it a movement because movements come and go. It's not a movement. It is a, evidence-based instruction which means when we do this, kids actually learn how to read. So I think we have to be careful about calling it a movement and really say it's evidence. It's evidence. And how do we know that kids are learning how to read? Because we look at the data. The data doesn't lie. Or, we look at the data and the data will indicate that actually when we use evidence-based practice, kids learn how to read. So the last thing, I will say is I believe we all know better and we have to do better by these kids. We know better, we have to do better. If kids are not reading by the end of grade 3, there is a very, very large percentage that they will not ever become proficient readers. And not because they can't read, because unfortunately, formal instruction comes to an end by the end of grade 2 or grade 3. You learn to read up until the end of grade 3, then you read to learn. The assumption is now you know how to read, let's move on. A lot of these kids have missed the boats. So we've got to do or at least, we have to teach well. We've got to do our assessments constantly to make sure that kids are developing those foundational skills. The statistic that if we identify a kid as struggling in kindergarten, it will take a half hour to do what will require 4 hours of intervention in grade 4. Why would we wait? Just for what purpose? If we could teach well and assess and make sure. So we know better. We just have to do better. We owe it to kids.
Well, yeah. That's I think a great spot to leave it. And if there's anything that you all want to share as far as links, obviously, Karen, the book is The Power of Effective Reading Instruction, How Neuroscience Informs Instruction Across All Grades and Disciplines. Karen is on social media a little bit, at least. I know because I've tagged her. And Sonya is as well. Don't let her fool you. She's not active. She's in there a little bit here and there. Christie, I don't think you are on social media. Are you on the Twitter X at all?
I am. I am.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll connect with you if I've not connected there.
Yeah,
But
maybe we have.
Okay.
And I don't know. It's become such a strange place, and so the idea of the ThoughtStretchers education community is to have better conversations in a place where we can actually make some progress instead of yelling at each other. And with that in mind, I really appreciate the three of you for joining me and being willing to give up some time to have this conversation, because it's obviously very, very important. So with that said, I'll say goodbye to everybody. Unless you want to unmute and say anything and give any links, please do. But otherwise, I think we have had a good discussion here.
I'll leave the links to, I know in the show notes or whatever they call that thing.
Yeah.
Yep. I think that's the best way. And just, it was really a pleasure having this conversation.
Yep. And hopefully we can have more. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.